everyone. So for the past 12 weeks, for about 3 hours every Thursday, I've been training to respond to calls on a mental health crisis line. So the crisis line is run by an organization called Contact, and the Mercer County branch of it is run by volunteers, some of whom are students at Princeton University. I've always wanted to do the training, but every semester I've always been busy on Thursday nights. But because of COVID and the virtual semester, this semester I was actually able to do the training. At Contact, we primarily answer calls and text chats on the main crisis line, but occasionally we also answer calls and text chats through the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So I recorded my thoughts and reactions throughout the training process as an attempt to understand how to help someone in a mental health crisis and to better understand mental health and suicide in general. And so I thought I'd share that journey with you guys. So this past Thursday was the first training, and we talked a lot about active listening, and there are a few strategies around active listening. So one is repeating the last word someone said. So someone's like, I am feeling super anxious right now, I'm not sure if I can turn in all of my homework, I don't know what people will think of me. And then you would reply, instead of saying oh well, why do you feel that way, you'll reply saying think of you, elaborate a little bit further. So just kind of repeating the last word or phrase that someone else has said. And the other one is just a verbal so if they say something, just say nod in agreement, or don't say anything at all and just let the silence be and let them think a little bit more about their thoughts. And then also using labeling. So when someone's I'm super tired and angry and I don't really even know what to do, then you would reply, it seems like you are feeling very confused or very lost right now. So just kind of affirming what they're feeling and replying it back to them. Yeah, and I thought these were really interesting tactics around active listening, because oftentimes I think people listen to respond instead of listen to listen. I think oftentimes people listen to respond instead of listening to listen. So by consciously thinking about active listening tactics and being sure to affirm and respond instead of respond and address or try to solve their problems for them, just kind of listening to service and acknowledgement of their feelings is a very interesting way of interacting with someone. Yeah, and I guess I've never really thought about a crisis line as basically a chance to be heard without judgment. Because I feel when you think of a crisis line, you typically think of someone solving your problems for you, but I guess that isn't really what people need. People need just to be heard, and I think that people have their own solutions to their problems already. So yeah, that was the first class. Definitely do not feel ready to answer any crisis line call. I think that's what the training is for, and if I'm able to finish the training, I definitely want to continue volunteering next semester. Okay, I realized I forgot to do a recording of my thoughts on Contact training last week and the week before that, so now I'm making it up. We kind of just built off what we learned in the first class about active listening and asking questions that really affirm people's experience. So saying oh, that it sounds like you are feeling this way, or it seems like this. Also, sometimes when people are looking to talk, don't necessarily guide them through a situation, but let them come up with their own solutions. So if someone's I don't know how I should respond to this situation, you can ask the question back what would you do if this happened, or how would you do this circumstance? So letting them come up with their own solutions is the best way to do it without seeming judgmental. And there's also guest speakers every class. So the second class there was a guest speaker on, it was someone who has struggled a lot with bipolar growing up, and is now an actor and mental health advocate, but he was talking about how there's a huge stigma around mental health still, and it was really difficult for him to get a proper diagnosis for bipolar because he kept being misdiagnosed as depression. And it was also very difficult for him to like, yeah, I don't know, there was just a lot of stigma. He didn't really want to be seen as like that person in his family. So it was very difficult for him growing up. And it's still something that he actively struggles with today. I would say all in all, week 2 was really interesting. We just kind of honed in on like things that we learned in week 1 around active listening. And it was really cool hearing the speaker talk about his experiences with mental health and the stigma around mental health. And then as for week 3, we just kind of talked about the theme of loneliness in the class. There was a really interesting statistic that was like the most lonely age group is ages like 16 to 24, which is, I guess, my current age group, people in Gen Z. I don't know, I think they tapped on a very interesting point that I feel like there's this persistent anxiety that pervades people in my generation around like the state of the world, relationship with other people, and it's really easy to feel lonely, especially when you grew up in like a social media dominated space. Yeah, so I just found that really interesting because I feel like when people talk about loneliness, especially chronic loneliness, not just like, oh, I'm lonely because I moved to a new place and I'm very new, but chronic loneliness where it's like been more than just like a small life adjustment, and it's been like more than a month. That kind of chronic loneliness is so painful, and I mean, I can imagine like times in my life where I felt extremely lonely, and it's really hard to grapple with. It's definitely something that I can relate to, and oftentimes people are just looking to like talk and connect deeply with people, and if you like have a desire to talk and connect deeply with people, you're not alone, and you're not like greedy or like burdening people with it. Like everyone wants to connect and everyone wants to reach out in some way, so that's all I can say. I think it's very valuable to have conversations, have like deep, meaningful conversations with people, and to feel affirmed in like what you want to do, which is what I hope I will be able to do through volunteering at Contact. Last week's training was about, the topic was around eating disorders and addiction. And yeah, I was really struck by like people's experiences with addiction, and I think it's worth emphasizing that like addiction is also a mental disorder. It's not just like I feel like our understanding of eating disorders or addiction is very like moral judgment based, and oftentimes like people have a reason and want to get better, but it's really difficult. So I think in the calls we try to emphasize like helping the person come up with a plan around their addiction or eating disorder, not prescribing anything like you need to do this or you need to do that, but just like turning the question around and being like, how would you handle the situation? Like if you're an alcoholic and you're at a party, like what would you do? Like are there people that you can reach out to like help you keep you accountable, or is there anyone else that you can talk to admit that you're struggling with something? So just kind of turning the question back around at them and helping them come up with a plan. It really helped for cases of like eating disorder and addiction. And today's training was around grief and loss, and I don't know, I thought it was like one of the most powerful like sessions this far. Yeah, I thought it was like one of the more powerful sessions this far. I guess I don't really have any like personal experience with like complicated grief or prolonged grief, but yeah, just hearing people's experiences with grief and loss like really affected me. I remember like one part of the training I just had like turned my camera off because I was like literally sobbing. I was like, oh god, it's so hard to grapple with like grief and loss, even though we all lose people at some point in our lives. It's really hard to like grapple with it, and I think that's something that we talked about in the training, is that everyone's like grief is very unique, and it doesn't help for you to say like, oh, I know exactly how you feel. In fact, like one of the best things that you can say to someone is like just admit that you can't make it better. Like I admit that I can't make things better, but I'm here to listen. or just like trying to be supportive without trying to fix things, because you can't really fix grief or fix loss. I mean, it stays with you. You just learn to cope and learn to live with it. So yeah, I think they emphasize like, don't say like, I know exactly how you feel. Instead say like, there's no way that I can make things better, or there's no way I can really understand how it feels, but just know that I'm here to listen. Yeah. And then we also talked about a little bit about the 5 stages of grief, and kind of talked about how like if someone's like really angry or guilty or feeling really guilty about something, it's often a sign of loss in some way, shape, or form. So it's not necessarily like grief can manifest in a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to be like the loss of a loved one or loss of a person. It could be loss of a pet, like loss of a job that means a lot to them, loss of some other thing, loss of identity. So grief and loss can come in a lot of ways, shapes, and forms. Yeah, it was a really heavy training. I think whenever I think about like people that I'm close to dying, it really makes me question like the mortality and meaning of everything. I mean, not to get super philosophical, but I don't know, I guess it kind of occurs to me that like the knowledge of death and our relationship with death is what makes life have such a like rich, in-depth experience and like color to it. So I don't know, I guess it's like 2 sides of the same coin. That's another thing that I was kind of like struck by in the training, was that like oftentimes when people lose someone dear to them, it helps to like talk about the person. So oftentimes people like tiptoe around. It's like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bring this person up. Like, oh, like, I'm so sorry. And then they'll avoid talking about the person that has passed. But oftentimes, like, if you're really grieving, you want to talk about them. You want to like relive those memories. You want to make them feel like they're alive for a moment. So even just like talking about memories that are really joyful around them, or just like your experiences around them, like, it really helps. So I guess that's one thing that struck me, is that like it can help to talk about the person instead of like avoid bringing up the subject like it's taboo. So both last Thursday and tonight was training on suicide prevention calls and suicide helpline calls. And yeah, it was really informative. I think they brought up a good point when they're like, when you answer a call and someone's like, some small part of them like doesn't want to die, and there's a reason, there's something that compelled them to call the suicide prevention lifeline, and that could be something that could like help them hold on for a little longer until they can get more help. Yeah, I don't know, the past 2 weeks have been really heavy. It's really difficult thinking about suicide. Yeah, I don't know, there's just like such a dark place that people go to, and that you can kind of feel when someone is like suicidal. Yeah, but I think I'm learning some like pretty useful tools around suicide prevention, such as like really trying to get someone to safety. So if they're like at imminent risk for suicide, being like maybe lock the gun in a drawer and step away to a different room, or kind of like delaying, but like removing them from the risk to themselves. So like if they're driving and plan to drive off a bridge or something, just be like, I'm really worried about you. Can you like pull over in the parking lot and let's continue to talk, and really just kind of hone in on the things that they like care about and that matter to them, and kind of like tie them back to like the world of the living. So yeah, I don't know, I think I'm learning some pretty useful things. Necessarily make suicide easier to think about or easier to talk about, but it does make me feel a little bit more prepared. Like if someone in my life were to want to be in a crisis or want to commit suicide, like, I think it makes me feel better equipped to talk to them in that situation. I think another thing that was really interesting was that like when you're answering like National Suicide Prevention Lifeline calls, you want to say like, hello, this is a National Suicide Prevention Lifeline in the first sentence, like name the word suicide, and then very early on ask the question directly, like, are you thinking of committing suicide? And if they say yes, like analyze the risk. So there's a lot of different levels of risk, but if they're like at imminent risk, like really try to talk to them, and if they need help, like get that help for them. Yeah, but I was also surprised by the like how rare getting like help is. Like oftentimes when someone is thinking of suicide, just a call to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline can like help them. Very rarely is it like you have to get the police involved or call 911 and really like intervene on the situation. Oftentimes, just by talking to someone, like you can really help out. And I think that's really important because oftentimes what you're looking for in a moment of crisis is like some sort of empathy and connection and someone to just really like listen to you without judgment. I feel like I definitely need a lot more practice in answering suicide calls. It's like very scary, and these are just simulation calls too. So the real thing, I don't know. I feel underprepared, but I think the most you can do is just practice simulations and understand that this is a situation that you've trained for and that you're doing the best that you can do. Yeah, so yesterday was the last meeting for contact training, and we just went over the management system and how to sign up for shifts and take calls and all that stuff. So I've been thinking about how I should end this video and what I've learned over the past 12 weeks, and I guess these are my 4 main takeaways. Number 1 is that I'm really excited to take calls, but also extremely nervous. But I think the training has helped me to make peace with the fact that I can only try my best, and the very fact of just actively listening to someone can be itself a very radical process. And I was also just blown away by the number of other volunteers that were also doing this training, especially because I personally know how busy and stressful a semester at Princeton can be. And then number 3 is that I've also really started to rethink of mental health in terms of overall health. So if you were seriously injured, you would call like 911 to get you an ambulance. If you were in a mental health crisis, I think you should call a mental crisis line and view it as a emergency. At the last meeting, the organizers were talking about how a new 988 number was in the works to link up directly to like National Suicide Prevention Lifeline crisis lines. So I just think that's really important and really critical and kind of taking a step towards how we're thinking about mental health crises as actual crises. And then I've also really started to think of the training in the same way. I kind of thought of my training for the last 12 weeks as if I were training to be like a first aid respondent, but for mental health. And it really reminded me of the first aid training that I did to become like an orientation leader for like outdoor trips in terms of like wilderness first aid. And then the last thing that I would just want to say is that I was just like struck by the fact that there's just a lot of darkness in the world, especially today with COVID and the impact that it's had on people. And I just think that like crisis lines are more necessary now like than ever before. So I guess that's just like my main takeaways throughout this training. I hope this video was informative or illuminating in some way about the process of like training to take these kinds of mental health calls, and thank you for watching.